Venezuela right now, where there have been more clashes in the streets one day after U.S. recognized interim President Juan Guaid'o called on the military to join him in getting Nicolás Maduro out of power. You can see the military vehicles there. They were involved in trampling over some protesters yesterday, and you can see the opposition members are still in the streets of Venezuela on the second day of these protests that were called by interim President Juan Guaid'o. Now, the Trump administration says it's closely monitoring the situation in Venezuela as the embattled president and opposition leader both call on supporters to take to the streets for a second day. Government forces fired tear gas and protesters responded with rocks during a second day of violence in Venezuela. Opposition leader Juan Guaid'o rallied supporters at a May Day protest in Caracas. He called again for a military uprising, but only a small group of soldiers broke ranks Tuesday. The U.S. and 50 other nations recognize Guaid'o as Venezuela's leader. The U.S. says Nicolás Maduro's regime is being propped up by Russia and Cuba.
People know his regime has failed. It's going to fall. The question is whether we can get a transfer to an interim president who will conduct elections.
The White House has called a meeting with military leaders, national security officials, and the Secretary of State to discuss the next steps.
When people say there are, all options are on the table, they literally are. But we work it as much diplomatically and economically to impose pressure.
Government opponents blame Maduro for the country's humanitarian crisis. Violence and hunger is widespread. But supporters of the Maduro regime also took to the streets for a May Day celebration. They vowed to resist what they called an attempted coup by the United States. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says Maduro hid out at a military base with Cuban troops Tuesday and was on the verge of leaving the country.
We literally had Nicolás Maduro getting prepared to get on his airplane and head out of the country before he stopped really at the direction of the Russians.
Maduro denied those claims on a nationally televised address, and he promised to punish the protesters squaring off against government forces.
I was on the street yesterday, for example, where military men on both sides of the protest fired at each other. Those scenes didn't happen today, but perhaps most significantly today, more and more people were onto the streets of Caracas, demanding yet again the full resignation of embattled President Nicolás Maduro and the start of a transitional period. But at the same time, we need to understand that at the end of today, at the end of yet another day of massive protest marches at the heart of the Venezuelan capital, Maduro is still, it seems, firmly in control of the presidential palace. At least he welcomed many of his supporters in the presidential palace in the west of Miraflores, while right here in the east of Caracas, in the east of the capital, the clashes are still ongoing. And Elliot, let me tell you, just a few minutes ago, a platoon of National Guard just passed by our live location on motorcycle, indicating that the clashes are indeed still ongoing in this area of Caracas. This can give us an idea of how tense and volatile the situations remain at the heart of Venezuela. But yesterday's military rise up and yesterday gamble by opposition leader Juan Guaid'o is increasingly looking as unsuccessful. Know that this is not just a local story anymore. A lot of international geopolitical implications here. Of course, the U.S. standing firm behind Juan Guaid'o's back, and it's not just the U.S. because Canada, the European Union, and many other countries around the region do recognize Guaid'o's leadership. But at the same time, countries such as China, Russia, Iran, Turkey, and most importantly Cuba, all with important economic interests at stake here in Venezuela and standing side by side with the embattled leader Nicolás Maduro. So the local story of and the complex story of the Venezuelan social collapse after 5 years of deep economic crisis has now such an implication on the global stage.
Hot political issue here, violence ramping up in Venezuela as thousands of protesters return to the streets for a second straight day. Event anti-government demonstrations.
Supporters of Maduro also turning up to mark the May Day holiday. Interim President Juan Guaid'o now calling for a general strike and protests every day until elections are held.
Local 10's Cody Weddle is following it all for us live now from Bogota, Colombia. Cody.
And Calvin and Lori, there are now reports of at least 2 young protesters who have died as a result of this violence. We cannot independently confirm that, but Juan Guaid'o has tweeted about those deaths. And of course, there are fears that that death count will escalate as this conflict drags on.
Dramatic and violent scenes this evening in Caracas after a day of protests. Protesters setting up flaming barricades to ward off authorities in eastern Caracas. This after they battled pro-Maduro military members and police throughout the day.
¿Qué cosas hay que cambiar que estamos haciendo mal y tenemos que cambiar definitivamente?
And as the battles raged on in the streets, Nicolás Maduro taking to state TV. Maduro promising serious changes for his government, calling for what he called a day of dialogue for the country. This is so people tell our government and tell Nicolás Maduro what should be changed and to create a plan of change in our revolution. But after today's violence, Juan Guaid'o and his circle unlikely to accept any dialogue that doesn't include Maduro's resignation. That violence included several attacks on journalists, the country's journalists union reporting 11 specific incidents. This video showing the moment local journalist Gregory Jaimes was shot at close range by rubber bullets, his gas mask bloodied. As neither side budges in this political standoff, their followers attempting to gain ground through violence.